you become almost a regular on my show these days, because I think it's important for me to speak to you on issues that we have grave concern about.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So what is your opinion about this particular election? Because most people say this is one particular election where you don't have any issue at all.
In one sense you don't, in terms of a specific issue that comes easily to mind. But it's a fascinating election for another reason, and that it's really a mix of two very fundamental issues. One is it's a battle between the national parties and the regional parties.
Okay.
And on the other side, it's a battle between the BJP and the Congress, as well as between local regional parties.
Okay.
The national parties versus regional parties, if you look at that as a long-term trend, you'll find that from a peak of about 84% of the vote of the BJP and the Congress taken together during Mrs. Gandhi's last election, 1980, it has steadily declined, and in 2004 it was less than 50%, the two parties together.
Okay.
So you have on the one side the national parties losing ground.
Okay.
On the other side, the smaller parties cannot come together because of local differences. The DMK can't come together with the ADMK, or you can't have the CPM coming together with the Mamata Banerjee. So you have those kind of problems. But essentially what is happening is, if you reach a point where, suppose in this election the national parties lose substantial ground, then you're really looking at a completely different political scenario.
But are we looking at the local or smaller or regional parties, or is it a different thing where we are not looking at national parties but you're looking at national alliances?
The alliances are not clear. Previously, I think even in the last elections...
No, but at least, you know, the timely, the temporary, the opportunistic alliances that we see.
In the past, the opportunism was secondary to the main alliance. You said you would vote for the NDA or you would vote for the Congress-led alliance, whatever they chose to call it later. But that was somewhere in the mind. You would have parties changing sides, etc., depending upon the numbers.
Marginally.
Marginally. Today that's not the case. Today you have a situation where...
anybody could win and anybody could be with anybody.
Yeah, you have a situation where Mr. Pawar is actively campaigning with the Congress in Maharashtra and against the Congress in Orissa within a matter of a couple of days.
Okay.
So there's I think today everyone is keeping their options open.
No, but what kind of an outcome can we actually expect out of all this?
See, I think we go back to the issue of two different groups or two different issues being raised. One of national versus local, and second is between the BJP and the Congress. The national parties as a whole can do well if one of them collapses. Then that vote tends to go towards the other.
Okay. But that's not a possibility at all.
If it's not a possibility, then you might very well end up with a third front government. Because then all the other parties begin to have a greater...
But that will be such a khichdi, I'm sure that it won't even last for long. Because, you know, everybody is looking for a stable government, and people have tasted the pleasure of having a government that was stable for 5 years almost. So who would even imagine wanting a khichdi kind of a government, which would itself form with the only premise that, you know, I mean, you cannot promise anything at all.
This is the idea
because there will not be a possibility of somebody coming up with a common minimum program, to any common minimum promise also to people.
I don't think the idea of a khichdi of parties or interests is not confined to it's not really a matter of number of parties. You must remember that the Janata Party was a single party, but it was also khichdi, where they couldn't come together on anything worthwhile. At the same time, you could have coalitions of a large number of parties, Kerala, West Bengal, which have survived for decades, or with minor variations here and there. So the issue is, do they have a common ground?
But do you think that it's a possibility that at least in the future, even if more parties come together to form a central government, still they could have a common minimum purpose of keeping the government stable for 5 years at least?
I think it's in everybody's interest to keep it stable, because one of the other interesting things about this election is, for the first time you have a new front being formed, which is endorsing as a prime ministerial candidate a member of some other front, like Mulayam Singh Yadav, along with Lalu Prasad Yadav and Ramvilas Paswan, have endorsed Manmohan Singh as the prime minister. So what you're seeing really is that there is a need for stability. They are even offering stability, but the ways of getting there, they don't want to compromise on how many seats they think they can win.
But these alliance groups are not at all cohesive, not just because, you know, I mean, they've not come together, but because they've not even declared openly as to who they are with in this particular election. Because you cannot definitely say that this is NDA, this is UPA, this is the third front, this is the fourth front, and whatever. Because, you know, I mean, there is no definition at all. So So that, how would even people vote for a party thinking of the country as a whole?
I think there are people who vote based on local issues, people who vote based on national issues. Those who based on national issues.
Do national issues play any role at all in this election?
I think they would, if their national parties are getting, say, about just less than 50% last time, and even assuming they drop further this time, there's a very substantial number of people who are voting presumably on national issues or with a national perspective. It's a different matter that the bulk of the population is on the other side voting with regional parties, regional issues, and going along with that. But nevertheless, I think there is a national perspective, and even the regional parties have regional issues in terms of each election, but they all believe that they're playing a national role.
Okay.
They're not really breakaway parties. None of them believe in
national role at what level? Concerning what issues? Because if you're talking about an AIDMK, perhaps only in relation to something happening in Sri Lanka, it has a national perspective. But otherwise, it's absolutely local, and it's sufficient for somebody to vote for that party as far as Tamil Nadu is concerned. But when you're talking about a national election, a Lok Sabha election, do you think it's really pertinent or even relevant that these local parties contest, or is it just a farce of democracy that you need to send some MPs to the centre?
I wouldn't be so harsh, partly because when we talk of national issues, sometimes we get stuck in national sort of closed boxes. You must remember that one of the issues that was solved during Mr. Devegowda's 11 months as Prime Minister was the water sharing agreement with Bangladesh.
Okay.
And that's simply because I think he brought in a local perspective to what was a national issue. He was able to, he saw it as just another boundary.
Are you trying to say that, perhaps by getting these smaller parties from very local areas, localized political areas, that you're actually trying to make it more cohesive, that, that's more a participative democracy?
It is, and it shows new
because
perspectives.
Otherwise, maybe the national parties could become a little too indifferent to very localized, aspects.
You see,
of the
there
country.
was a time when the Congress, soon after independence, was very sensitive to local issues. It really was a coalition of local interests,
leaders,
local leaders. Even you had district level leaders who knew had a way of getting things done within the party. Once that disappeared, that role has to be played by people outside the party.
Okay, but not just understanding the parliament as a body which discusses national issues only in terms of international arena or problems, but also as a platform for all these different groups to come together to at least declare themselves as belonging to one country.
Absolutely. Also, I think it's important that you have a large number of these groups, because you have diverse interests on the ground.
Yeah.
And when you bring them into Parliament, you have some chance that the discussion will take place in Parliament and not on the streets. So it's very important, I think, that these diverse interest groups
should not understand the Parliament as just a place where you discuss international issues. It's also about the country, it's also about the states, it's also about everything that concerns every citizen of...
Right. I would personally like to see greater sort of debate, meaningful debate in Parliament rather than disruption. But even disruption is something that is better done within Parliament rather than on the streets.
The way you say, then don't you think it's perhaps imperative that we really start encouraging local regional parties, because perhaps if one regional party gets the support of all the other parties to become the leader of the nation, fine, because then it's not about opposition in party, it's just about consensus.
See, ultimately we might get a stability which is based upon regional interests represented in national parties, but as long as national parties are not able to represent regional interests, you have to make do with regional parties. And I see nothing wrong in that.
But what kind of coalition can you actually have in a government? Because when you have such different ideas, for instance, when there are problems between two states, how can you actually solve it? Because at least when it is solved by two national parties and discussing at a very different level altogether, do you think the possibility is much different and better?
I would think a regional party has a greater chance of making the compromises needed to come to an agreement. A national party would generally stoke up regional fears whenever it wants to win an election, then forget about it later, which has been the pattern with both the BJP and the Congress.
At least if a regional party makes a commitment, it's bound to actually keep it.
In the sense that it knows where it can compromise and where it cannot. It knows what it can sell and what it cannot, because it represents those interests. Whereas if you have a national party which is always trying to sort of reach out to them.
It's going to be a very tough parliament, I said.
See, all parliaments over the last few
But
parliaments
that's
have
the
been
way you
very,
expect it to be. That's very
absolutely.
idealistic. But you know how the parliament's time was spent in the last Lok Sabha.
See, I think if you see it in terms of actual policy making, I wouldn't blame the parliamentarians for that, because essentially your whole policy making process has been taken out of parliament.
Okay.
You have a PMO which really sits down and makes the whole set of rules, the policies, and then it gets passed through various ministries, and that's how we are functioning.
Okay.
Now, if you say, okay, parliamentarians are not talking about it, they don't get a chance to talk about it. You don't have a process where actually parliamentarians represent their local interests in parliament.
Okay. And what do they do in the parliament?
But right now, the member of parliament just gets a certain amount of money which he can go and use
MP-led.
in MP-led, which he can use in his constituency.
That's all it is.
Unless you become a minister, you might be able to do something, but I don't think it's more than
But
that.
there are no provisions for even that in the constitution. You're supposed to reflect the aspirations of your voters
Exactly,
or your
but the
constituency.
moment you come to a system where you're bypassing that and making policy making separate from the parliamentarians,
I mean,
then
aren't the
you're forced to give
parliamentarians
them
aware of
something
it?
else. Yes, but what's happened is that you have an anti-defection law that does not allow you to vote against your government. Now, if there is a vote on a particular issue that hurts your constituency, but your government is taking a different position, I cannot represent my constituency.
So what you're trying to say is that the anti-defection law itself is detrimental to this system
certainly.
of democracy.
Most certainly. I think like in the United States, you should be able to vote for any issue.
Cross-voting.
You can vote for an issue that you believe in, that you are representing your constituency.
So as long as you're not voting against a government in no confidence
Exactly.
motion,
You just
maybe
have to
for
put-
that only that you can have this
Exactly.
anti-defection law, right?
Right. But on
But why
specific
didn't anybody think about it?
Well, because they would like the power, the people in power would like to retain that complete total power with them. So they are not going to allow you to do a thing like this. In fact, every effort is to just strengthen the anti-defection law so that you just have no way of.
So that way, why are we actually
decisions.
having these elections at all? Because, you know, if ultimately we are going to elect many more MPs to the parliament or the same number of MPs, we're just going to sit there and take some money every year and spend in their constituency and do nothing apart from voting for their government.
Yes, but
The rest would be doing nothing but sitting there and shouting.
they need not come to parliament.
At all, actually.
In fact, there are people like I think there's at least one senior MP in Karnataka who happily says, I don't need to represent my constituency in parliament. As long as I take care of my constituency, there are other people to take care of parliament.
Yeah, but actually when you don't have any business in the parliament at all,
Right.
why go there?
Right. So we have created a
I
situation.
mean, is it okay if some...
No, I think it's
no,
the other
it's not
it's not
okay,
okay.
but
It's
in
the other way around.
in the
We have
present
created
system,
yeah,
we have actually created a certain system which is parallel to the desired system, where I think it's absolutely all right even if it does, if
Right.
an MP
So,
doesn't
right.
go.
So the solution is not to say you don't go to parliament. The solution is to change the system and give
But
them
it's
more
not
power.
possible at all, because, you know, like you yourself know, every time the parliamentarians are making more and more rules, or, you know, bring in systems only to ensure that, you know, they have very little work in the parliament. Like in the recent case, you know, when about 17 bills were passed in just 12 minutes.
Right, because it's not their concern. You see, as long as they're just trying to take care of the constituency in terms of
And why
immediate
even ask them
requirements.
to vote for it? They can sit at home and vote through internet, right?
No, but that is like saying that because something has gone wrong, I just confirm that.
Okay.
Point is, what has gone wrong is that you have reduced the role of parliamentarians. And if you're going to survive as a democracy, you have to look at ways of reviving that.
So the process of selection is just to elect a government.
At the moment, yes. Which is why people are willing to take candidates from any party. It doesn't matter. I just get them elected, and they become, they cannot vote
So I
against
think
me.
what the
and that's
politicians
it.
are doing is just right. I mean, just suitable for what is now.
No, what is a situation that we have created? But ultimately, a democracy will function only when we can take local interests into policy making via parliament.
But things have really not gone awry or wrong, right? Because, you know, even with all this experimenting, you know, things are just fine. So maybe they'll ultimately
I'm not
decide
so sure
that
about
if
fine.
things are just fine, I mean, at least they're
I'm not-
appearing fine.
No, I'm
till
not so
something catastrophically wrong.
No, how do I know? For instance, I'll give you a simple thing in Bangalore. We have a situation today, if we look at, say, garment workers, 75% of them walk to work because they cannot afford bus fare.
Okay.
Right? Now, is there anybody or any institution that's able to bring this into a meaningful debate in policy making? There isn't.
But then there is a government, right?
There is a government, but
the parliamentarians can actually at least write to the government, represent their constituency.
Right, but if you look at, say, policy making for Bangalore itself, none of these people are involved. You had either earlier you had the BATF, now you have Abide.
Because most often these parliamentarians are not even taken into confidence.
Absolutely.
You have all these external people coming and talking about it.
So nobody knows
some cases, the most favored MP comes and sits in a committee.
Even if it's an MP, I can understand. Most of the time, it is just a rule of people who don't represent
have any direct representation or role at all, no locus standi.
Right. So what happens over time is that you end up with an election in which people are just going to look at winning it. Parties don't matter.
And a very frustrated lot who are just waiting for the next election.
If you lose, but if you win, you're okay. You're waiting.
Even otherwise, you're waiting for one more elections, perhaps at least whether you made enough money before that. So
no, you converted it into a completely personalized patronage system. So every party now says, all right, I pick up the people who have used that personalized patronage well and try and give him a ticket for my party because I know he can't quit later.
So this party politics also don't matter to a great extent today because anybody could be sitting with anybody ultimately.
It won't change policy. It's very unlikely to change policy. I can't think of one major policy that's going to change because party X or Y or Z comes to power.
So unlike what it was before, like you had Congress representing certain values, certain policies,
let's leave values
certain
out
principles,
of it.
certain outlook, certain...
Let's keep it at policies. Those are all larger issues.
But now there is nothing like that because when you look at a party, it's just about whether this party is going to win or not. That's all it is.
Right.
It's just the name.
You see, which is why even policy making has a separate channel. It works through the bureaucracy, it works through a group of experts, and then you influence whoever comes to power.
Now, everybody knows that there's something fundamentally wrong because most people do not follow what is there in the Constitution, though they swear by it. Then why is it? Can't they question in the Supreme Court, or can't somebody bring about some kind of a...
I think there is a need to recognize that the process of we have sometimes get carried away by the whole idea of cohesion, smoothness. I must have smooth policy making. If I were to ask somebody, would you care for a representative kind of policy process which will be much more disruptive? They say, no, I want a smooth process. So when you do that, smoothness is when there is no dissent. If you don't want dissent,
then why democracy at all?
Precisely. But unfortunately, that's the way we think.
Is it also because we do not have MPs who are either not qualified enough to speak in the parliament or not informed enough to speak there, or not actually
in terms of education,
vocal.
I think the last parliament had
what is the use of education?
You have of MAs
even now you have somebody like
graduates.
Varun Gandhi who is educated enough, but you know how he speaks. So does really education correct or change a person's personality such an extent that we can blindly assume that just because you're educated you must be a better person? There could be a lot of uneducated people who really behaved in a more civilized manner just because of the fears of dharma or culture and society and values.
Right. So are we in a position to see what is happening?
No, because this blanket accusation that just because you're not educated enough, maybe you're not good enough for the country.
No, that's not true at all. In fact, the Indian I don't know the exact figures, but I think the current parliament might very well be more educated than say Nehru's parliament.
And it was no better.
No, that was much better in some ways.
No, this one.
Yeah, this one was
because you had more corruption. You had corruption inside the parliament. You had such objectionable things happening and people talking in all kinds of languages and being rude.
You see, because you've reduced parliament to a situation where it's not making policy. It's just passing policy made elsewhere.
Now, what are people doing? They're just shouting at each other.
Yes, because I'm going to get attention. I need to catch attention.
Because otherwise, people are going to, like even the newspapers, just talking about some inane things about, what did they do for their constituency? What can actually a parliamentarian do?
No, he can do a lot. So there are people who use...
Under the Constitution?
Even at the constituency, you have this amount of money that's being given to each constituency is not small. If it can be,
what can you do? Because in the Constitution, you do not have any right by which you can really ensure things to happen.
No, you could create a lot of. If you give me 2 crores for a particular constituency and say set up an employment program or remove bottlenecks in unemployment.
Because doing good work will not ensure votes, right?
I'm not so sure about that. Has anyone tried it? Has anyone tried to actually create sort of employment generation kind of schemes using the 2 crores a year for that? And at the end of it all say, I lost, I'm willing to accept that argument. But have we tried it? I don't think any of us have.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem, that we are not identifying what we're still functioning as if the old 1950 model of policy making through parliamentarians is in place. It's not. It's not been in place for the last 10 years, at least, maybe longer. So they are then trying to just survive on the basis of taking care of their independent constituencies.
But after so many years of democracy in this country, are politicians willing to listen to people like you at least once in a while? Because, at least you're sitting there and watching and writing about it and studying and all that. There are many more people who are doing all this. But don't you think politicians just believe in practical politics? Because that's more applicable and relevant, and that's the only thing that works. Because may not be that works in the long run, but who is bothered about it? Because everybody is bothered about the next election, not the next generation.
See, if you're talking about the next election, then we should not have any change in an MP. The 500 odd MPs who get elected in one parliament, if whatever they're doing is practical, then they should all get re-elected in the next parliament. That doesn't happen.
And that's not because of their performance at all, right?
It is.
Many more reasons.
So it is not practical. So this whole argument, this is the practical way to do things, would hold only if that works for them again. It doesn't.
So today you have about the candidates declaring their assets, and that some of them have declared it to be much, or rather something, in some cases it's also quite negligible, and in some cases you have somebody declaring almost close to 300 crores. But does it mean that just because these MPs have some money that we demean them, we actually insult them, we talk bad about them? And what kind of an election, what kind of leaders are we looking at? We really write about them as if they are jokers. We treat them as if they are good for
Which I think is fundamentally wrong.
Because the journalists writing all these things, how clean are they to begin with? I mean, are you trying to say that, there is everything nice about everything else in the world, that, only politicians are wrong, and, only those who are waiting to get elected are the ones who have every blemish on their face?
No, I agree that you cannot get into a blame game here. But I think what is more important is I wouldn't rule out the possibility of candidates actually overstating their assets when they
just to ensure that
to ensure that, because if I'm being
in the next election,
if I'm functioning in patronage politics, people must believe I have the money to give out.
Yes.
Right. So if I'm an unknown candidate, I'm more likely to overstate my assets.
Yes.
Right. So what you're really creating is a situation, first of all, where parliamentarians are separated from policy making, and then you're creating a situation where I have to just pretend I have more money than I do, so that people will come to me thinking I will help them. Now, once you've created this situation, your policy making becomes very undemocratic.
Because if I show that I have more money, people at least will believe that I'm not going to be as corrupt as the other guy, because because we are all facilitating these things for people.
Right. But the underlying thing is the separation, because once I separate the two, then my parliamentary election just becomes a matter of getting local people who can win elections into my party, putting them up, and then working out the arithmetic afterwards.
But that's not this election at all. Have you been watching it very closely, the kind of money that's come into play, and the kind of alliances that are taking place at the very local level, the kind of invisible camaraderie that is there between even opposing parties and all that. I mean, it's more of a farce, in spite of all of us wanting to respect this election and thinking that it's going to do good. What are the options we have?
I think the important thing is, an election is important simply because you're choosing a representative. The representative may not be in a position to do as much as you would like him to do or like her to do.
But at least there is a representative.
And that's very important. I don't think we should ever underestimate that. Right? And what happens with the representative is that you're functioning in a situation where morality in terms of what is right and wrong has been deliberately put on the back burner, right down to the point where the voter himself or herself does not have that morality. They say, pay me and I'll vote.
Okay.
So that bribery previously used to bribe the MLA. Today the MLA bribes the voter. Call it democratic, call it what you like. but it's still the same model
I've
system.
always had this question, how right is it when you've chosen somebody to be a representative, you voted for him and you've sent him to the parliament, that you start, accusing him for doing things or not doing things and all. But don't you think the moment you vote for somebody, that you've accepted that it's okay for me that this guy is going to be my representative?
I wouldn't accept that, because I think
No,
when I
because,
vote for him, I have the
somebody
right.
has actually come forward asking whether you would want him to as your representative, because it's not a job. It's not, the man becomes something else by taking
But
your
however,
votes.
if I vote, I have a right to find out what you do.
Yeah, find out.
You're
But,
saying you're going to represent
what are you
this.
giving him? Because it's just that you've elected him, you've sent him. If at all he lives on the money that the country gives him, I'm sure that it's not the kind of money that anybody would be very proud of. He'll be traveling by first class or second class.
No, I think they're well taken. No, I think they're very well taken care of. That's not an issue.
But it's not better than any of the better jobs that many people hold in this country.
Fair
but
enough.
to say that he is the worst man of all, if at all he doesn't perform, but everybody else at every level can do all mistakes and get away. Don't you think this itself is going to be very demoralizing for politicians to work well?
More than demoralizing, what happens when I reduce a performance to an individual and I just take a set of 540 odd individuals separately? If you look at what we have done as a result of separation of policy from the parliamentarian, is that we have reached a situation today where each parliamentarian thinks of only his constituency. The macro picture is completely missing. And then when they come into government, if they do, then they are just left completely dependent on the bureaucracy. They don't have any view of what should be done, what should not be done. They don't know what their constituents want done. That exercise has completely died out. And that's the most serious concern, because over time you're going to have a series of policies which don't reflect the concerns of people who should be taken into account.
Okay, but in this election, what do you think people will be seeing in the Congress party?
Well, as I said, it's one of the two national parties, and there are two.
No, but because you're not talking about. Of course, it's a scandal-free government. That's what they claim, and most of us have not heard of any scandals at all. Unless BJP starts speaking about it, maybe in the next term. But what can somebody, see when they look at this party?
As far as bulk of the rural voters are concerned, there are two very important things, and one is the loan waiver, and the other is the National Rural Employment Guarantee.
Okay, but they say it's not really worked in Karnataka at all, because most laborers earn more than what is the minimum wage that is
but
paid
it's a guarantee. If I have an insurance, I might be earning more than what I would get with that sort of guarantee. But the fact that guarantee is there is a huge relief. It's even a relief for the urban worker who, if there's an urban crisis, goes back to the village.
Oh, okay.
So I think that insurance, just the idea that's there, even if I don't use it, just the idea that it's there is a huge sort of safety net. And that's something that I think a lot of people will think about. Whether they vote on it is a different matter.
Okay, that was a very ambitious program of the party too.
It's probably been one of its successes. The results will tell us whether it's had any political
What
follow-up.
about the BJP?
The BJP right now seems to be caught in two minds as to which way to go. And that
starting very late, perhaps.
I think perhaps Mr. Advani had a clearly worked out strategy which might be getting unraveled by people lower down, who are managing to get a lot of attention for issues which are more extreme, whether it's Varun
But
Gandhi
is there a single issue that, because they're talking about, once they said it was terrorism, now they say it's corruption. That's what Mr. Advani said recently, that he has actually pinned down what's going to be the issue for this election. But corruption is not such a, I suppose. Because
I think if you're looking at it in terms of, we must make a distinction between a campaign issue and what's on people's minds. Because on people's mind,
what do you think is in
I think people's mind, they would like a certain calmness, a certain comfort level as we continue to progress, partly because at a time of economic crisis we want to get out of it, but certainly there's a great deal of interest in a certain calm and consistent development.
How big is this issue of terrorism?
See, terrorism is certainly an issue that worries all of us. But the question is, when a party tries to blame it on X or Y, most people know that's frivolous. We all know there's something more to terrorism than just that. It's not the fault of X or it's not the fault of Y. People say we should make a tougher law, but a tougher law has not stopped it before.
Pakistan is suffering from it, and why not India?
Exactly.
Okay.
Sri Lanka, everybody is. No issues. Okay, you're probably.
It's not a very isolated, very.
No, there is a need for a lot of
Okay.
attention to be paid to this issue.
Tough terror laws and all that. What the BJP
But tough
talks
terror
about.
laws can become tough misused laws.
Okay.
You see, so the question really is, we must be very careful when we are toughening the law. We need to instead toughen implementation.
Who do you think will do well in Karnataka, according to you?
Oh well, it's a straight three-way fight with
Yeah.
with
Three-way fight?
I think certainly in some constituencies it is three-way. I think the simple exercise, you must have seen that if you take the assembly election votes and club it into parliamentary elections,
But things are
the
better
Congress
or
would win
different now for
12,
the
the
BJP?
BJP would win 12, and the JDS 4. That's the pattern that emerged from that. Obviously parliamentary elections are very different.
Okay.
But the trouble for the BJP is just this, that they're starting from a very high base. They won 18 seats last time. So even if they have to run very fast just to stay where they are.
Okay, okay.
See, whereas the Congress did badly last time, so even if it gets to 12, it can feel very comfortable about it.
Okay.
So I think in that sense the BJP has more on its plate. But they're following three very different strategies. I think the BJP is willing to say, at least as far as candidate selection goes, that we get the best candidates from whichever party available and put them up. The Congress has gone back to its old war horses. And the JDS is looking for newer people who just come in and reach out to people who are looking, sort of aspiring to rise up the political ladder. So there are three different strategies. And
I mean, the outcome could be very different for each party, but one thing that's inevitable is that, you know, if we care for this country, we need to vote.
oh, absolutely, there's no doubt about it. Because as I said, no matter how much you criticize the quality of representation, we cannot do away with representation. That is absolutely essential.
With that, Professor Pani, I need to thank you for the show because we don't have more time to discuss more about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my pleasure.